Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. A warm welcome to you once again this evening to the Sulaiman Ravat show. We need all the warmth we can get because what are they saying? The coldest spell in a decade. I hope you're keeping warm. More importantly, that you're keeping safe. Hajj has come and gone, and we did quite a bit in the last week on the Hajj broadcast. The day of Eid has come and gone. I hope that under the circumstances you had a joyous Eid. Now let's talk about what has happened in the last 2 weeks or so in South Africa. The looting, the rioting. Now that the dust has settled a little, I mean, we're far from over with the issues at hand. We try and unpack some of what has transpired, try to make a little bit of sense of it, try and talk to various people from various backgrounds and get their perspective and their analysis on the issue. So the lineup on this evening's program is Angelo Fick from Asri, a regular on the program, Professor Daryl Glazer, an associate professor of politics at Wits University. And joining us a little later in the program will be Shoaib Musa from Muslims for Humanity. They were quite active in coordinating the relief effort in KZN, especially in those initial few days when the situation was most severe and acute. And we also expected to be joined on the line to talk a little bit more about community activism and the security issues by Yasin Teba from Vision Tactical. So that's the lineup that we have this evening on the program. Let's welcome our first two guests. Angelo Fick, as always, a very warm welcome to the program. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
And Professor Daryl Glazer, welcome to you as well. I think it's the first time, so it's a pleasure to have you on the Sulaiman Ravat show.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to join you this evening.
Angelo, if I can start with you, right? Before we go into some of the specifics, and there are a lot of issues that we need to touch on in the limited time that we have, now that, a number of days have passed and to some extent the dust has settled, so to speak, what are the overarching thoughts in your mind, Angelo, in terms of what just happened in South Africa?
I think we've seen some weaknesses in government, in the administration itself, both inside cabinet and in the agencies that government controls in order to run the country, among them the police and the intelligence services. But we've also seen the fractures in communities that have been there for a while, come once again into the public gaze and being exploited by people with their own rather complicated motives. And we've seen some positives in terms of people's responses, but I think, something is rotten in the state of South Africa. And once even this dust settles, we're still going to have to deal with the causes of what brought us to the last 10 days of violence and community, shall we say, dissolution.
Daryl, same question to you. I mean, just the main thoughts in your mind currently.
Yes, well, I still feel that I am working a lot of this out in my head, just like a lot of people are. There's been a lot of quick commentary, and I suppose that at a level of generality, I'm sure that commentary is essentially correct in saying that we've got here some combination of a Zuma-inspired political uprising and spontaneous, opportunistic criminality slash food riots, etc. Some combination of top-down conspiracy and bottom-up participation, giving expression to popular grievances. But I think there's still so much to learn about how it was possible that an uprising took place on this scale. I mean, this is not something that many people anticipated. Yes, to be sure, there are those who've been warning for a long time that South Africa is going to burn at some point because of its extremely high levels of inequality and poverty and so on. It was one thing to say that in some general apocalyptic warning way, but I don't think anyone anticipated, or very few did, certainly I did not, that things were going to come to a head, and on this scale quite so quickly. So precisely what all the different elements are still have to be worked out. I mean, how was it, if it was a pure political uprising or insurrection, how was it possible that we haven't yet been able to identify exactly who instigated it? how is it possible that a political faction which was never very good at governing seemed to, on the face of it, be extraordinarily skillful at igniting a simultaneous rebellion across the length and breadth of KwaZulu-Natal and stretching into Gauteng. Were there things that we didn't fully understand beyond simply the background facts of poverty and inequality? I mean, is there some sense in which the population of large parts of KwaZulu-Natal was primed or self-primed for an explosion on political grounds? You know, I know that people from KZN often talk about how it's a different world to the one we know in the rest of the country in many ways, you know, when it comes to talking about Zuma, for example. Is it possible that there's been a building sense of frustration at the supposed persecution of Zuma in KZN, such that, you know, someone simply had to light the fire of that frustration? These are all questions that are going to, if you like, launch 1,000 research papers in the next months and years.
On the issue of the insurrection, Angelo, we are hearing people make this argument that, yes, there are people who are still loyal to Zuma within intelligence structures. There are those who are not directly loyal to Zuma, but their interests are hinged on him. If he goes down, it's much easier for them to be held account for their alleged corrupt activities. And therefore, we should believe that this could have been planned, you know, in great detail. But then there are others who are arguing and saying that it seems a little too convenient for the Ramaphosa faction. It will serve them politically to claim this was an insurrection, help Ramaphosa to marginalize the RET faction within the party and broader and beyond the party. Is there adequate evidence at this stage to suggest that this was an insurrection, as the president wants us to believe, especially when his own ministers seem to be contradicting him?
Well, I agree with Darrell that we are quite close to these events, and sometimes distance helps, and sometimes the passage of time reveals much more evidence than we currently have available to. It doesn't inspire me with confidence that the president shifted his explanation in the space of a few days from it was ethnic mobilization to it was insurrection. The sixth administration certainly has a bit of a problem, a conundrum ahead of them, which is they want to, one, signal that they're in control of the society that they govern and all of its institutions, and at the same time they have to explain to the voting public in an election year why it is that events went as far as they did if they're so in control. So that kind of Scylla and Charybdis, that rock in a hard place that they're trying to navigate, may explain some of these contradictions. And they're also very quick to come to conclusions given the security intelligence failures that led to the very violence that they then had to deal with. Some of these threats were made on public platforms, on social media, even in media interviews on broadcast media. And they obviously didn't take them seriously enough to act upon them. And then afterwards, there's a very nice way of indicating, as you say, the delegitimation of these people involved by suggesting that it's a planned insurrection or an attempted insurrection if the Minister for Transport in his recent BBC interview is to be believed. And we've seen this particular party in government struggle with terms on what to call things when they become trapped in certain kinds of events. We saw the same or similar arguments about whether to call it xenophobia, common criminality, or Afrophobia in 2015, 2014. This is not new. The inability to come to terms with an event is partly explained by poor intelligence, but also partly explained by the internal paranoia of the governing party that still operates as if it's a liberation movement facing enemy sort of forces, sometimes outside of itself, sometimes outside the state, and sometimes within its own ranks. And that hasn't really helped the ANC and its government employees explain adequately to ordinary South Africans what has happened, how they're responding, and why they're responding the way they are.
Right. Initially, the president seemed to suggest that they wanted to be careful in as far as sending the army out was concerned, and they wanted to be careful in terms of, the police getting stuck in there. They wanted to avoid a Marikana, in the words of Beki Qele. Recently, he seems to have done a bit of a mea culpa. He seems to be acknowledging that they were ill-prepared and they didn't get it right. The key question, though, is that was it just poor planning on the part of government once these things happened, and that the pace of it kind of got the better of government? Or is it more an issue of poor capacity, that the army doesn't have the capacity because of the slashing of budgets or whatever else, that the police force has weakened over a period of time and are simply not competent? Because if it's poor planning, that's easier to fix than a lack of capacity, Del.
Well, you know, I think there clearly has been some degradation of state capacity in many spheres, and there's surely, whatever the degree of central planning as opposed to spontaneity here, there must have been signs, visible in social media and in other places that something was about to blow. But I have a certain amount of sympathy for anyone trying to make sense of what's going on, and I think there's a lot of hindsight being exercised here. We always have to bear in mind that what has just happened is totally without precedent. If something like this had happened before, I would be more completely scolding than I am now of the intelligence apparatus of the state for not seeing what was going on. It was very difficult to anticipate that something on this scale was going to happen. But still, now that the government is forewarned, presumably the various branches of the state are going to do a much better job of monitoring what's going on. But I think that it was very difficult to figure out, and it doesn't surprise me entirely that you've got government ministers contradicting themselves. I know that politically it's important for a government to have a collective line. But in a way that, in being confused, the government is not very different to many of the rest of us. Of course, we look to the government for reassurance and for a steady hand. And I suppose Ramaphosa does offer some of that sense of calm that is valuable in this situation. But, as often in the past, Ramaphosa comes across as calm and presidential and at one level quite hope-inspiring, but too little gets delivered. So, I mean, the big question is going to be whether, the state has the capacity going forward, first of all, to anticipate an uprising like this, and second of all, what's ultimately much more important, but much longer term, is addressing a situation where such a large proportion of the population seems to be marginal from the economy, and was so ready to join this kind of free shopping spree that the looting represented for a large chunk of the poor.
All right, so we are talking about what transpired, trying to analyze, make sense, unpack the looting and rioting now that the dust has settled a little. So far, we've been speaking to Angelo Fick of ASRI and Professor Daryl Glazer of Wits University. Now, joining us on the line from Durban, we've got Muslims for Humanity's Shoaib Musa. Shoaib, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum salam, Maulana. Thanks for having me on, and assalamu alaikum to all of your viewers.
I want to ask you the same question that I asked both Daryl and Angelo when we started. Now that a few days have lapsed and you've been able to catch your breath a little, not much, a little, what are the foremost thoughts circulating in your mind as to what happened and why, in your opinion, it happened?
Well, personally, I think this was months in the making. And I think it was a matter of time before this happened. Perhaps you can argue that they were ill-prepared or they didn't listen to the intelligence apparatus. But I think I don't think any of us in our wildest dreams expected it to be as substantive as it was. So look, but I'm not a political analyst. I may have certain personal opinions, some of which may not sit very well with certain people, but I'd rather just maybe not comment too much on the political side.
Now, the reason we have you in the program, right? You guys, compliments due to yourselves and others. You sprang into action very quickly. You got relief efforts underway. You put in place some sort of structure. What was it like on the ground at that particular time? How would you describe it? I mean, you're a resident of Durban yourself, and you live between Durban and Maritzburg, and these were two very hard-hit areas in the KZN province. On the one hand, what was going through your mind as a resident, as a citizen, as a human? On the other hand, what was the effort like, trying to get in place almost without any preparation, these relief efforts?
So I think I went to bed on Sunday night knowing that there were going to be problems the next day. In fact, on a Friday, I got stuck on the freeway on the way from Durban to Pietermaritzburg and ended up sitting on the freeway for 2 hours because they blockaded the N3. And we knew that there were issues. So we already had heard by Sunday evening about trucks being burnt at Moy River and what have you. And we took the decision that those that had to travel longer distances to get to work shouldn't go to work. But I don't think anything prepared us for what we saw when we woke up on Monday morning. So, I woke up for Fajr on Monday and I had already seen on social media videos of things that had happened overnight, while we were sleeping. And I think this was like just total shock. So for the first day, that Monday, I think there was just absolute numbness and disbelief and shock on the part of everybody. And I mean, it was almost surreal. The next emotion that came to mind was that of protecting your home, protecting your family, and especially your family, because the worry then was, that the next stage was that they were going to start looking to loot residences. So the communities, and as you know, all communities that were affected rallied very quickly to set up local community watches to blockade their roads and what have you. And I think that for the first 24 hours, the priority was safety. And it was fear. We all were scared. Our children were scared. Our wives were scared. Our parents were scared. You never imagined in your wildest dreams that this would happen. And it's like typical with any major incident or any major traumatic incident. The initial part is shock. And that's what happened. And the next morning, on the Tuesday morning when I woke up, my wife asked me, do you know where people can get bread and milk from? Because there's a number of people that have been phoning me looking for bread and milk. And I think that literally maybe just turned the switch into another course. And as Muslims for Humanity, we met at 11 that morning and we made the decision we need to do something. And that's where it started from.
Yeah. I'm going to get back to you in a minute, Shoaib. Angelo, I'm going to get Shoaib's perspective from, ground level in terms of the racial issues, right? But before we hear from him, we spoke earlier on about the president referring to ethnic mobilization in the first speech that he gave. He seems to have walked back a bit on those comments. Now there's all these allegations about Phoenix in particular and racial tensions there, and allegations and Malema and the EFF seem to be in the forefront. Is this part of what was always boiling there beneath the surface, and that it's not surprising that it has come to the fore? Or how would you analyze now that the whole racial angle to what transpired last week? Angelo?
So in the 2 years that I lived in KwaZulu-Natal, in Ngundlovu, my sense was that it was, as people tell Daryl as well, that there were dynamics that were slightly different from other parts of the country that I have lived in. And race played a significant role, but it wasn't the primary role. Class also played a significant role, and inequality within cities and between the city and the rural spaces of KwaZulu-Natal certainly shaped people's understandings and the way in which politics worked there. So I'm not suggesting that racism forms part of the fabric of KwaZulu-Natal life, but what I'm saying is that it could be exploited. The idea of divisions along race mapped onto divisions of class and deprivation, and that it could be exploited by people, whether they were seen as beneficiaries or whether they were seen as victims of this race-class nexus in KZN. And so that kind of division explain some of what was going on, and not just in Phoenix, but in other parts of KwaZulu-Natal. This is still the province, let us not forget, that gave us Mongeni Ngema's controversial Ama India. This is not a space in which race difference has been disappeared like it hasn't in the rest of South Africa. And so when we look to the events in KwaZulu-Natal, it's important to see how race was used rather than to use race to make sense of it. Because members of all communities of the old racial divisions of KwaZulu-Natal rallied in defense of businesses, and there were members of all sorts of communities participating in what would be called looting. And one cannot simply divide it by race in the way that I think many outsiders would really like to, because it would make it simple for who were the victims and who were the perpetrators.
Daryl, your take on Malema and the EFF's positioning on what allegedly transpired in Phoenix. Do you think they are raising legitimate issues, or they are opportunistically trying to latch onto the race card to create some sort of relevance for themselves?
It's very difficult for me to judge where I live in Gauteng. And as far as I can tell, very few of us understand exactly what's happened in Phoenix, and how so many people came to die, if indeed the number have died that are alleged. But as far as the EFF is concerned, I mean, the KZN has historically been an area of weakness for them, and they've been on the lookout for ways of burrowing into the politics of KZN. They've, after having initially been very anti-Zuma, which was not a good thing to be, arguably, in KZN, they then, Malema has since to some degree reconciled with Zuma, but also playing the anti-Indian card, I think, has been a central part of the EFF strategy for establishing some sort of political base in KZN. So not only for EFF, but for a number of political actors, this is an opportunity now to play that card for all that it's worth, because, just like xenophobia in times past, there is a certain kind of popular constituency for this kind of racial, sectarian, and ethnic sectarian politics. It speaks to genuine grievances on the ground. And what are grievances on the ground from a politician's point of view? Amongst other things, they are opportunities. They are opportunities to mobilize. So yes, I think that this is one of the things that we're going to have to watch most closely and with most concern, is the extent which these kinds of longer-standing grievances are exploited by politicians seeking to establish or consolidate a political base in KZN.
Now, Shoaib, we've heard from the political analysts, right? From yourself, as a person in the community, you spoke to us early on about community mobilization and how the community came together, and the first priority was security, to secure especially the residential areas. Thereafter, the relief initiatives commenced. Now, broadly speaking, it seems to me that within the community, there seems to be two viewpoints on the race card now coming to the fore. They seem to be those saying, well, yes, race is an issue in South Africa, and as a Muslim community, as the Indian community, there are certain shortcomings, and we can't be blinded to that. Others seem to be a bit upset that race is now being used as what they feel almost a distraction or a deflection. They feel, what else can you expect of a community but to defend themselves in a robust and aggressive way when their homes and their properties and their families are under attack? Even in terms of the relief efforts, they feel you cannot begrudge a community under those circumstances for looking after those in the immediate vicinity first. From ground level, what are your thoughts, Shoaib?
Malana, we had a chat exactly a week ago on your radio show on Radio Islam about a very similar issue. So first and foremost, I must tell you, you can't generalize and paint everybody with the same brush.
Yeah.
So likewise, I think we need to be very careful here. And I heard what the other panelists have had to say, and I agree that people are going to look for the opportunities over here to drive their agenda and to effectively increase their popular base. And I think we need to be very careful here. The reality is, you can't generalize and say, well, it was black Africans that or blacks that were doing all of this, so all of them are bad. I mean, as I told you last week, and I reiterated again, maybe it's less than 1% or less than 0.5% of the total black population in South Africa. Do we then cast everybody with the same in the same breath? Do we paint them the same way? You can't. It's not fair. Likewise, I don't think it is fair to make this Indian black thing. I agree with everybody who says they had absolutely every right to defend their property and defend their families. I mean, you were almost under attack. Phoenix was probably under severe pressure in that full 3-day period because it was surrounded virtually by substantial hotspots. So I have friends, I have colleagues that are living in Phoenix, and a lot of them have told me, you know, so I have a colleague that didn't sleep for 3 nights because he was so worried about defending his family and protecting his family. And the point is that what do you expect? However, as you have bad elements within other race groups, you do here as well. And I must tell you that I do agree to a certain extent that there were people that went a bit too far. But again, it doesn't mean that everybody is bad. And you know, the sad thing for me is that when I look at especially what the EFF has been punting in terms of how Indians treat everybody else, or treat their employees and so on, that's primarily a target or an accusation you can label against a wealthy Indian. Phoenix is not surrounded by wealthy people. Phoenix is primarily inhabited by people that are probably amongst the poorest of the poor in our country. So I think you need to strike a balance here. Two wrongs don't make a right, but and I don't justify the excessive use of violence that a lot of the Phoenix or that Phoenix people are accused of. But the reality is they had every right to defend their property.
We touched on this briefly, I think, when we spoke about a week ago, but it's a touchy issue. I want to bring it back up for discussion because we need to discuss these things, Shoaib. The issue of some within the community, out of the anger and the emotion of being under attack in such an unprecedented way, making comments of the nature that, you know, the looters and the rioters came from the same areas where historically the communities that were attacked and looted were doing their charitable work. And now they felt, you know, you're biting the hand that feeds you. From a moral Islamic perspective, we know that your charity is for the pleasure of the Almighty, and irrespective of how the recipient then treats you, you need to continue to do the right thing for the right reasons. Was that a fleeting thing as that kind of sentiment diminished, or do you think it's something we still need to deal with?
Hey, Manara, I still hear those comments, right? Sadly. But I think, you know, we need to go beyond this now, and we need to think about it. So I'm not even going to go about, I'm not even going to talk about whether that view is correct or not. We know, and I have emphatically disagree with that view, as I explained to you last week. To me, I think we need to look bigger. We need to look beyond that. So, you know, we've all heard the statement about giving a man a fish and you feed him for the day, teach him to fish, so you feed him for life. But I think that's the problem. As a culture, we give, but are we empowering? Are we taking them out and seriously empowering these communities to a level where they don't become dependent on handouts? And I really think our whole system of charity and welfare, we need to examine it. You know, we are quick to distribute food aid. We are quick to do certain things at certain times. But when we don't see crisis in our view, we walk away. So I think there needs to be a balance over here. And to go again and say that, you know, these people are biting the hand that fed them, you've got to maybe, that's why I say, look behind it and say, why? You know, whatever little we've been doing, they're still hungry, they're still frustrated, they don't have housing, they don't have access to sanitation, they don't have proper jobs. I mean, it's a combination of a whole host of factors that have led to this. And as Muslims, you know, particularly, we need to accept that there's a reality out here that is way beyond us just giving out a food hamper once a month and patting ourselves on the back that we've done well.
Angela, we've spoken about some of the political issues. We've spoken about, you know, the issue of race. We've got Shoaib's perspective in terms of how things were perceived at ground level. I heard one traumatologist that we interviewed sometime last week say that, yes, there's the aspect of poverty. There were those who perhaps did what they did because of poverty. Then there were those who did what they did purely because of greed. There may be those who were opportunistic. They happened to be close by. They saw everyone, taking things for free, and they decided to cash in. But it also seemed like that there was a lot of anger. That's why perhaps the looting and the destroying of property, even after the shop was totally cleared out or after the mall was totally cleared out. Does this tell us that we've got a deeper societal problem in South Africa, that there's a deep resentment amongst the have-nots towards those who have?
Yes, I think that there is a far more complex underpinning set of set of constructions that are the consequence of the society we've built over the last at least 27 years in our post-apartheid imagination. So put aside the longer-term effects of colonialism and apartheid, just what we've done over the last 27 years in democratic South Africa. And then Shuaib's point is something to take into account, that all of us have to take into account. The society of great inequality and deprivation and desperation is not one that was accidentally visited upon us by aliens. It's one that we make every day, with unequal payment for work without dignity, for insecure employment, for all of those things. We make them. And this is not to excuse people's actions, but there's an assumption that, and it's an assumption that the state is repeating in its actions, that poor people are somehow morally more misguided than the rest of us, and that if we can only somehow rescue them, then this wouldn't have happened. But the moral lack, or the poor moral guidance is happening in the state right now. The people who are being arrested are ordinary South Africans whose houses are being searched for looted goods. The kingpins have not been identified. We don't know who they are. Whereas poor people's faces and bodies are displayed on social media by state accounts to say, look what we're doing, we're actively arresting people. And that distinction is something that I think we have built in this country to give poor people absolutely no dignity and no sense of possession. It is what explains the violence that happened in Alexandra Township last year during the first lockdown, where the South African National Defence Force could subject people to the kind of humiliations that they didn't do to middle-class protesters on beaches in Cape Town or other parts of the country. So there is a sense in which we don't have a war against poverty. We have a war against poor people in South Africa. And it's a war that I think we will need to rethink our own habits of being as members of middle class or upper middle class, societies, groupings, neighborhoods. But it's something that this entire country will have to revisit, because there is an assumption that you can have business as usual and somehow give people crumbs and somehow life will continue to be vaguely sustainable. No society with the levels of inequality that South Africa has had for the last generation has sustained itself very well. We've seen the kinds of insurrections, true insurrections, not of the kind imagined by the African National Congress government, in places in North Africa that were exploitable by foreign powers and by people inside the country who had a much more cynically politically invested interest. And so, yes, I think a wholesale revisitation of how we structure the society is urgently needed. We don't have time to wait for this to go away and somehow reinvent ourselves later. We need to reinvent ourselves as ordinary South Africans are doing in their communities on the foot.
Daryl, in terms of the way forward now, right? What has happened has happened. A lot will still come to the fore. A lot is still to be learned. We know quite a bit in terms of what has transpired. When we look at the different role players and the different elements going forward, and if we have to start with government, is there anything that you see at this stage that gives you confidence? I'm hearing some saying that all what has happened, as tragic and as horrible as it was, perhaps it will now strengthen President Ramaphosa's hand, and he'll be able to root out the rotten elements from within the party, from within his cabinet as well. Or do you see signs here of further retrogression on the government front, Daryl?
It's too soon to say. I mean, on the face of it, it looks like we've had a massive uprising that at least contained elements of insurrection. It looks like at least the insurrectionary part of it failed, as in Zuma is still in prison and Ramaphosa is still the president. So in the immediate term, this uprising and this insurrection looks to have been contained or pacified or thwarted. But we've still got protests being organized around the Zuma issue in KZN over the next few days. It's going to be important to see what happens. And then there are going to be ANC elective conferences in the future where these issues will continue to pan out. So, I mean, one possibility is that, yes, the Zuma faction or the RET faction has essentially exposed all its hands, and it's basically lost, and it's going to be marginalized, and that Ramaphosa and his faction are significantly strengthened. There's some reason to think that that might be the case. You know, the fact that ultimately this uprising was contained to certain parts of the country, the fact that many of the institutions of society basically held up, the fact that we've got our food supply, it appears, going again quite quickly. We've resumed our vaccine rollout, which is now starting at last to go relatively well. So that would be from the point of view of someone who sees Ramaphosa as a more kind of pragmatic and desirable leader. Those would be positive signs. But on the other hand, you know, the situation is obviously still volatile, and there's obviously still a lot we don't understand about the political dynamics on the ground in KZN. You know, I think that there's so much speculation. I mean, to me, it seems like the political part of this, the top-down political part of this, came from within the KZN ANC. It didn't come from the traditional leadership. It didn't come from organized crime. They were all, although those are all interwoven with each other, admittedly. But it came centrally from and with the imprimatur of the ANC. I think this is what, not necessarily the ANC leadership at the top in KZN, but the branch structure, which would have the kind of comprehensiveness needed to set in motion at least the political side of this uprising. So, you know, one of the obvious things we're dealing with here is a major split in the ruling party. Essentially, it looks to me like a large part of the branch structure of the KZN ANC is fundamentally and even potentially physically and violently at odds with the rest of the ANC. So, you know, part of what we're going to be seeing playing out is whether the ANC, which for all its sins has been a fairly effective force at holding South Africa together, whether it's going to split apart, and in that case, we'd have to see what the consequences of that are going to be. As there might be some positive, and there could also be negative consequences of the ANC shattering in that way.
Shoaib, you know, we've touched on two issues in terms of you know, the previous comments with yourself. The one was the community mobilization, and the other, the relief efforts at which you guys were in the forefront and in many ways central to. When you look back, and like our guests have been saying, that there's still a lot that we need to digest, and a lot that we need to work through in our minds, and there's still a lot of information will come to the fore. But from your own experience on the relief forefront and being a person of the community, seeing the community mobilization, what would you say were some of the lessons learned that would hold us in good stead going forward? I see some within the community are making the point now that, look, this realization has got to dawn very quickly, that don't have any expectation in government, make sure community has the capacity to protect itself from a security perspective, to look after itself from a humanitarian perspective. There are others who have lost hope altogether in the country, saying it's time to seriously look at options of you know, moving overseas, etc. When you look back at the last 2 weeks, what would you say are some of the lessons that you've learned, and what are your own emotions and thoughts about the future and the prospects of our country going forward, having been on the ground during that period?
Well, I think that we are now at that fork or that crossroads where we need to make a choice. A choice needs to be made, not by us, but primarily by the ruling party, as to which road we're going to take. Look, I'm convinced that this was planned exceptionally well, and you can see that the businesses that were specifically targeted, they were very specific, was that managed in a very specific way. You know, to me, I think we've got too much vested in this country to talk about moving away. The reality is, then, if you're not prepared to be vested and you're not prepared to be part of the fabric of society, then you should emigrate. But personally, we've been going through a huge roller coaster of emotions over the last 12, 14 days, and the reality is that there was a high level of despondency in the early part of last week, and a lot of people, myself included, seriously had to look at our priorities. Do we want to continue staying here, or do we want to go elsewhere? And to me, I think after things had calmed down by Wednesday, I knew in my mind that I can't go, and I'm not going to go, and I need to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. And I think this is the way we need to think. Yes, I think there's a lot of structural issues within South Africa. There's no doubt that our police services have been weakened substantially. Our defense force has been weakened substantially. And in this instance over here, by the way, if the police had sufficient resources and had the capability, there would have been no need to call out the defense force. And even the defense force to mobilize took them 4 days, 5 days, honestly. So there are issues. But if we're going to continue looking at the negativity, then we're going to be in trouble. I mean, to me, what I've been taking out from this is there are lots of silver linings here. And we need to take advantage of those silver linings and not be despondent.
All right, we're almost out of time. Yasin Teba from Vision Tactically in Gauteng was supposed to be with us earlier on. He had some emergency, but he's joined us now. Yasin, assalamu alaikum and welcome to the program. Assalamu alaikum, Yasin, are you there? Just trying to see. I got an indication from the technical staff that Yasin was with us. I thought we'll get a quick comment from him before we close. Let me try one more time. Yasin, assalamu alaikum, are you with us? All right, I think we are not able to somehow connect with Yasin. Let me just ask Angelo and then Daryl for a quick closing remark. Angelo, you can go first.
Yes, I think, much is left to be learned from what has happened to us, even those of us who are not centrally affected by the violence, but will be peripherally affected by what this does to the fabric of the society we live in. And those lessons have to be taken and put into action sooner rather than later, because inequality can only be undone actively. People's bruised senses of belonging can only be remade if we actively involve ourselves rather than simply wait for somebody else in the form of government or some politician to come along and do it for us.
And Daryl, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, look, I mean, we all understand that things can't go on the way they are. What we can't all do is agree on the way forward, and this is part of the problem. You've got people on the left who think that what we need is something like a transition to socialism, and you've got people on the other side who think that what we need now is to stabilize the environment for private sector investment. The truth is our path is a social democratic path that involves needing to do a bit of both, redistributing and also providing a climate in which investors can invest. We can't escape those alternatives. We need to tackle corruption. This is something around which I think there is a consensus. We need to enhance state capacity. This is something around which there is a consensus. All these things are going to have to happen if we're going to address these problems long term.
And then Shoaib, in your closing thoughts or closing remarks, if I could ask you perhaps to tell us that the relief obviously was coordinated on the spur of the moment as things happened, because it was unprecedented. It just happened overnight. Going forward, I think the spirit of giving, the spirit of wanting to be of assistance is definitely alive within the community. We saw that. What lessons have we learned, though, in terms of going forward, being more coordinated, being more structured, things that the community should keep in mind when it comes to relief?
Well, I think, firstly, I must tell you that everybody's been amazing. The generosity and the hearts of and the way people have opened their hearts speaks to true humanity. And it has really, really been humbling to see how everybody in the community and how our communities outside of KZN have rallied to assist us. I do think that the one issue that does need to be addressed is that of coordination. Um, sadly, what I see, what I've noticed happening is that some areas received far too much of relief, and other areas received virtually nothing at all. Had there been some form of central coordination, we probably could have spread that relief out far more equitably and far more into areas that probably needed them more than the areas that received them. And that was one of the reasons for the formation of Muslims for Humanity, which was to try to get all our NGOs underground, whether they be Muslim NGOs or non-Muslim NGOs, to work in coordinating together and working together to avoid duplication and avoiding a situation like we had where some areas received nothing and others received too much. So I think, to me, that is fundamentally the most important lesson. I mean, we are moving now from relief and we are moving into the aid sphere, and we need to be careful, as the others have said, not to create this expectation of dependency, but also now need to start working on true empowerment.
Shoaib Musa, Angelo Frick, and Daryl Glazer, thank you to you all for your contributions and for your time and participation this evening. I really appreciate it, and we look forward to hosting you on the program in the future again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam. Jazakallah, everyone.
All right, we've run out of time. That's it for this week. Until next week, inshallah. Fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.